Good evening and welcome. It is time once again for CU Immigration here on WRFU LP Urbana 104.5 FM. I will be your host for this evening. My name is Mr. Garza, and I'm here to let you know that WRFU is an open forum for the Urbana-Champaign community. Views expressed are those of the speakers and are not intended to represent WRFU or UCIMC, or, as we like to say on this show, UPTV, because we also broadcast on public television as well. Or YouTube, for that matter, because we're also on YouTube. So we're all over the place. Anyway, this show is our opinion, and by our, in this instance, I mean myself, who will be offering verbal opinions, and people whose writings I may happen to read, who will be offering their own opinions, and through me, to you. And from those, you can make of them what you will. Okay, so this is a show about immigration. We've been on forever. This is probably like a 300th or 400th episode. I don't know how many we've had. I suppose to a certain extent, because it is a single issue show, immigration, it tends to be repetitive and probably for some listeners maybe a little boring. I don't know. I hope not. But I can understand that, because for me it is difficult to think of something new to say about this topic, because over and over and over again, it's just the same kind of situation. We have people who want to come here and contribute and make something of their lives, and in the process enrich our country. And then we have people who just don't want anybody coming here. And they invent reasons for that, mostly because there aren't a lot of real, tangible, truthful. I guess is the only. I was trying to think of a different way to say it, but honestly, there aren't a lot of truthful reasons why not. There isn't too much that you can look around and say, "Oh, look, immigrants really are destroying this or that, or they are pulling this down and creating that problem." You can point to specific incidents like, oh, here in Pittsburgh, this one person who happened to be an immigrant, robbed a store or something. And then you can say that's shows that we can't let immigrants here, but that's all nonsense. And we know that because this is a nation of millions, and out of millions of people, there are going to be all sorts of people that behave in all sorts of different ways. Some good, some bad, some really, really, really antisocial. And that holds true for immigrants as well. There are less immigrants than there are, people who were born here in this country. So there are far less of them doing it, but there are certainly some somewhere who are doing something that they shouldn't be doing. So that's not really a good argument. You can say that it could be a good argument against certain kinds of cultural behaviors that people hold on to. I would argue, for example, that gun culture is destroying is maybe too strong a word, but has severely damaged this country. America's love of guns, our gun culture. And so the very people that are sitting out there going, "Oh, wait a minute, you can't blame guns. Guns don't kill people, people kill you," and all that kind of stupid nonsense. I mean, look at it. The culture of guns in movies, on television, in video games, everywhere. It's guns, 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 guns. And people are shooting each other. And that's how they solve problems. And that's how they resolve problems. And one of the biggest ways that people defend guns is because we need them to solve problems. We need them for safety. You have people that carry guns to the grocery store. What's going to happen to you at the grocery store? I mean, seriously, I'm 65 years old. I'll say my age right here. And I've been going to the grocery store at least since I was an adult, at least, once a week or so, sometimes more often. For a while there, I used to go every 2 or 3 days. I wanted the freshest food, so I would just go and buy enough for dinner. And maybe, 1 or 2 days, and then I'd keep going. And yeah, it's kind of a waste of time and energy, but I had fresh food all the time. Very fresh. Once the pandemic came along, I decided to stop that. I tried that whole, like go shopping for 2 weeks. You should have at least enough food for 2 weeks or something like that. I remember people saying, I tried that, but you have to get a lot of frozen and packaged food to last you that long. You can only get fresh food that's only going to last so long. So I boiled it down to 1 week as being the longest I could shop for, where I could have pretty much fresh food every day, and not resort to lots of packaged and processed stuff. That's just me. That's the way I like to eat. That's what I think is healthy. But yeah, what a weird tangent. See, that's what happens when you put a microphone in front of me and tell me to talk to people. I just start talking, and apparently I can go on for a long time and get very lost from what I was starting to. The point is, I've gone to the store a lot. That was my main point. And I have never even felt slightly threatened at the grocery store. Never, ever. And so the thought that somebody goes around carrying a gun because they think that maybe someday someone's going to shoot up their grocery store and then they're going to be shooting back is sheer nonsense. And it exists to the extent that there is any truth to it. It exists because there are people who think that they need to carry a gun to the grocery store because they may need to shoot somebody. It is the notion that guns and shooting people solves a problem that creates the problem that those people feel they need to solve. I mean, let's face it. If nobody had a gun, you wouldn't need a gun to protect yourself, right? I mean, what would you be protecting yourself against? Well, someone might come at me with a knife. Well, carry a knife then, I mean, it's like, it's a sheer nonsense. I'm not going to get on another tangent here. Now I'm talking about guns. Anyway, I'm saying that is a big problem and a huge problem for this country. And that's something that you can point at and say, yes, look at the damage of that. It is very difficult for anyone to honestly point at immigration and say, look at the damage of this. There just isn't. So the problem surrounding immigration, the controversy, the thing that makes it such a fraught issue, are the people that just plain don't want immigrants here, or don't like immigrants, or think that there's something wrong with them, or want to reserve this country for true Americans. So I thought I would start off this program. In particular, I found a couple of stories about Native Americans' perspective on immigrant issues. And I thought I'd read them because it's just what it comes back to, what this argument seems to always come back to, is who has the right to say who belongs here? Who owns here? Who owns this notion of here, this place? And so a lot of people, many people will say, well, we do, I do. I was born here. This is my country. I have a right to say who belongs here. Well, how did you get here? That's where the argument always kind of becomes complicated. And then someone will point to the fact that the only people that really have a right to say we belong here are Native Americans. And then you'll have the inevitable person that comes up and says, oh, but they migrated here, back in 10,000 years ago, or whatever their notion is. They've got a lot of different notions. There are people that actually will argue that the peoples that we currently describe as Native American or Indigenous American are actually the ancestors of peoples that came over here and displaced or killed off the original Americans, whoever they were. And then, it gets really cloudy as to who that supposedly was. But supposedly there was someone here first, and Native Americans came, and who knows? I don't know where they get that idea from. Probably it's more wishful thinking than anything else. I have never read anything that really supports that theory or that reasonably could be construed into that theory. But agreeing with or going along with the whole land bridge concept, and you will find a lot of Native people that argue strenuously against this, but many scientists say that the Americas were populated by people that came from Asia over between Alaska and the Russia area. There was at some point apparently a land all the way across, and they migrated there and then came down the coast and then migrated up and did all the different stuff. And a lot of recent findings in anthropology and archaeology have been pushing back against that narrative, but there is still a strong narrative that this is how human beings came to North and South America. Because supposedly we all started out in Africa and evolved from there and spread out from there, which is entirely possible. I mean, that may be what happened. And I wouldn't personally argue against it. I don't have a faith issue with that, whereas a lot of Native American religion is based around the notion that they were from this space. They were created here by the Creator, put them here in this space, and that it is there. So, it's science against faith once again, and there's always some difficulties there. And because of those difficulties, then you have people that like to misconstrue it, and you end up with a bunch of nonsense. But in any event, I think most of us, not all of us, I'm not going to say everybody agrees with this because I already know that some people don't. But I think most of us will agree that if anybody has a right to say, we belong here in North America, specifically the United States, it would be Native Americans or Indigenous Americans. So from reading their perspective on immigration, I think is important, because if anybody deserves to have a right to say something about this issue, it would be them, because they're the ones who are like, okay, we've already suffered from who knows how many years of oppression and genocide and displacement and horrible things from people, immigrants coming here, actually colonizers, colonial settlers, or, you can call them a number of different things, but they were people coming here from somewhere else. Let's just put it that way. And the notion of invaders, which is really popular amongst anti-immigrationists, is in part based around this idea that people are coming here to displace us, to take this place away from us and turn it into their own space. So that's where you get this, like, you can't have Muslims here because they'll just impose Sharia law, blah, 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 so on and so forth. So my point, yes, I do have a point, is that if anybody has a perspective on immigration, it would be Native Americans. So here are two articles about that I wanted to read to you. The first is entitled, A Native American's Perspective on the Immigration Issue. And it reads as follows. Dear U.S. and international immigrants, this letter is addressed to the immigrants already living here in the United States, and also to those currently living abroad who hope to one day become Americans. There is probably no other group with more of a reason to be wary of immigrants to this land than Native Americans. But we do not fear you. Today we live in a country of immigrants. We welcome you, and as we have welcomed generations of immigrants to these shores since even before this great country was founded. As we follow the recent discourse about immigration sentiment and policy, it is worth remembering that Native Americans' tragic history could have become the basis for a permanent grudge that would have prevented today's debate from ever occurring in the first place. The genocide of our ancestors by settlers from other continents could have been a rationale for Native people, the very first Americans, to seek to block all others who wished to come here in the search of freedom. But that would have been the wrong path. In the words of the great chief Joseph, we have always known that all people were made by the same great spirit chief. Ours is a country of immigrants. To be American is to proudly welcome the huddled masses yearning to breathe free, and America is far better off for having welcomed people from all parts of the globe. That welcoming spirit has enabled our country to lead the world, demonstrating by example that we value freedom, equality, justice, and the rule of law. You have enriched our culture and our lives, and we value you in our workplaces and our communities. Here in central New York, most of our workforce at the Oneida Indian Nation consists of immigrants or the descendants of immigrants, and we provide language translators so that they can immediately become part of our team. Meanwhile, in Utica alone, 16,000 refugees have settled in the city in the last 3 decades, a point of pride for the citizens of our region. As a sovereign nation, the Oneida people understand the significance of well-delineated boundaries, and we value our strong, distinct cultural identity. We know that America is a place of different groups with different heritages, religions, and creeds. We believe this shared diversity is precisely what makes this country so exceptional. It is worrisome when some opportunists attempt to use the very same diversity that enriches us to instead stoke division, fear, and hatred in an effort to stop more immigrants from coming here. That appeals to mankind's worst instincts. We know from painful experience that the threat of terrorism is real, and that our nation must be ever vigilant against those who seek to do us harm. Yet we must not allow fear of extremism to obscure our values by demonizing larger groups of people who bear us no ill will. As an immigrant, you may be feeling anxiety and trepidation about the policy debate presently unfolding in the United States. Please know that you are not alone in the fight for fairness and equality. Over the past few weeks, we have witnessed an unprecedented upsurge of public outcry against anti-immigrant sentiment. From small towns to big cities, a broad coalition has united around the cause of inclusion and respect. These gatherings evince unity around a shared set of principles. As the first people of this land who fought alongside George Washington during the Revolutionary War, the Oneidas are proud to stand with our fellow patriots in promoting these positive values. In the coming weeks, we will be working to marshal the energy of Indian country that has fought so valiantly in so many other important battles in the courts, in the halls of power, and in the streets. Whether it is the fight for civil rights, the fight against racist mascots, the fight for sovereignty at Standing Rock, or now, the fight for a welcoming and humane immigration policy, Native Americans know that these conflicts are really part of a larger epical quest for basic equality. The righteous cause of welcoming deserving immigrants and recognizing how much you benefit our society has lasted for generations and will go on for generations ahead. That is not something to lament, it is something to cherish, because our cause is just. As Americans, we believe we have a responsibility to ensure that we leave the world a better place than we received it. The Oneida Nation, as many of the Indian nations in this great country, believes that to do so, we must consider the impact our actions will have on each other of this next 7 generations. So while I know this may be a troubling time to be an immigrant in America or a foreigner coming to our great country, I urge you to find comfort in knowing that the ongoing quest for equality and human rights will continue. We have strived to create a society that in its hearts, its deeds, and its policies recognizes that we are enriched by our diversity, having all been made by the same great Spirit Chief. Okay, that was one letter. And this next letter is a bit older. It's from 2019, I believe, but I think it still seems relevant, and so I will read that one as well. And this is from Deborah Haaland, who is now the Secretary of the Interior, I believe. Anyway, this is entitled, Trump Wants Immigrants to Go Back. Native Americans Don't. The president and his followers lack the moral authority to tell anyone to leave this country because they are not indigenous to this land. Last week, President Trump told 4 of my colleagues to go back to where they came from, even though all are American citizens, and only one is an immigrant. But Mr. Trump has somewhere to go back to as well. He is a second-generation American. For Native Americans like myself, his comments are perplexing and wrong-headed. If anyone can say go back, it's Native Americans. My Pueblo ancestors, despite being targeted at every juncture, despite facing famine and drought, still inhabit this country today. But indigenous people aren't asking anyone to go back to where they came from. When I heard the chilling, hate-filled chants coming from the president's rally the other night, I thought about my fight in a committee hearing earlier that day to protect my ancestral homeland of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico. The Bureau of Land Management plans to sell leases in the area for fossil fuel extraction. In the late 1200s, my Pueblo ancestors migrated to the Rio Grande Valley from the areas of Chaco Canyon, Bears Ears, Mesa Verde, Grand Staircase Escalante, and other places. I want to protect these sacred sites for future generations and against this administration's policies that puts profits over people. This administration has put a premium on leasing federal land to oil companies and neglects to consider the impacts that drilling has on sacred cultural sites. For thousands of years, the Pueblo people have inhabited this continent. We developed food sources and a strong agricultural tradition, and we perfected rock and adobe architecture. Without Native American knowledge, experience, and intelligence across this country, many Europeans would not have survived their first winter. This is the first time in history that someone like me has a platform in Congress to give this perspective. This year, I joined Sharice Davids of Kansas as the first 2 Native American women elected to Congress. The resilience of our communities and our drive to protect our culture is the reason we believe that everyone has a right to be here. The fact that the president claims this country as his own and wants to keep everyone in their place proves that he doesn't understand his place. I question the standing of anyone who would call to send my sisters and colleagues, Congresswoman Ilhan Omar, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, Ayanna Pressley, Rashida Tlaib, or any other American back. As a 35th generation New Mexican and a descendant of the original inhabitants of this continent, I say that the promise of our country is for everyone to find success, pursue happiness, and live lives of equality. This is the Pueblo way. It is the American way. Those laying exclusive claim to the American dream lack a clear understanding of this country's history. The tenets of my cultural teachings are rooted in our commitment to lift up every community member so that no one is left behind. Work and food were shared equally through our commitment to community. We care about children, even when they aren't ours, and we want our old folks and yours to live their last days in dignity and comfort. As a member of Congress, I work to ensure that I live up to my ancestors' legacy. Indian policy throughout history was meant to exterminate us, but we are still here. This administration's policies are reminiscent of the darkest days of our history, when the government took Native American children from their parents and put them in boarding schools and forced Japanese immigrants into internment camps. This is an administration that separates and cages children and asylum seekers and bars people from coming to our country and serving in our military based on who they are and how they worship. Racism and bigotry should never fuel any administration's policies. Calls to send anyone back contradict who we should be as a country and the ideals for which we stand. The president's tweets and words matter. It's on all of us to call out what is pure hate and racism and stand up for one another. There is no moral high ground from which President Trump or any of his followers can tell anyone to leave this country, because they are not the first inhabitants of this land. They should instead look into their history to learn where, when, and why their ancestors came to this country. There is space for everyone here. We must look back to our Native American history to remember that. So there you have a couple of statements from Native American people about immigration, and I just wanted to share those with you because it's a topic. We cover a lot of different topics here, and we discuss them in a lot of different ways. I am a second-generation immigrant, and so I have that perspective of knowing something about where my ancestry came from and having some difficulty and conflicts with resolving the way I was raised, the things that are kind of part of me as just a being, from birth, and the things I see around me and the ways that I have to try to fit into society generally. It can be difficult. So this notion, we've discussed this many times before, this notion of a melting pot, of assimilation, of people coming here and just becoming kind of this homogenized thing called an American, is a pretty difficult process when you're actually living it, or when you're actually experiencing what that process is like. It's complicated. It's not as easy as it sounds. I think there are people that just imagine that you land in the airport or come over on a ship or however you get here, and that you just pick up a little American flag and start waving it, and then go to a baseball game and eat a hot dog and I don't know, it's like this very superficial notion of what being an American is. But it's complicated. It's really complicated, because what it means to be a citizen of a country is different than what it means to be in love with the national identity, if I can call it that. Because there's this notion that patriotism is based around this love, this embrace. Like you saw, speaking of Trump, you saw pictures of him. At times he would go like hug the flag. He'd hug a flag. Like, what does that even mean? What is being portrayed there? I love this flag. I love this country. But what does that mean? What does it mean to love your country? I would argue that it means to want it to, the place you live, to be a great place that promotes positive values, that embodies positive values, that lives up to what it believes in. I mean, it really comes down like, what does it mean to be a good person? If you meet somebody for the first time and you're like wondering, oh, I wonder what kind of person this is, how do you judge them? I judge them. I listen to what they say. I observe what they do. And one thing I do is I try to sync those two things up. Is what you're saying matching what you're doing? Are you someone that actually lives the things you claim to believe in? Do you spend time criticizing others and never critique yourself? Do you do the same things you criticize other people for? Like, all those different things are how you judge whether someone is a good person or not. I think, a lot of times it's like, are they nice to me? Like, well, I used to be, I used to be afraid of so-and-so, but they're really nice to me, so I guess they're a good person. Someone being nice to you doesn't make them a good person. For many years, I was a musician, and I traveled. Well, I'm still a musician, but I mean, profession, that was my profession. And I traveled around playing, and there was one place that I played in, one of the bands that I was in. There was a guy there that just loved me for some reason. And I'm a drummer, and I would let him play my drums. He'd come up and do this one song every time he was there. And he was just like my best buddy, or that's how he treated me, and that's how he acted. I was waving and being really nice and friendly and all those things. And later I heard he was arrested for killing somebody, and he barricaded. It was some weird story. I can't remember it exactly, but somehow he was finally arrested for barricading himself in a house after he'd killed somebody. And,